All right, great day, Gadfly subscribers. It's Carlos. Want to welcome you to another Gadfly live stream. Today is Cinco de Mayo, so happy Cinco de Mayo for all those participating in festivities today, Wednesday, May the 5th. And thank you for being here. We really appreciate the Gadfly subscribers for supporting our work that we do over on the Gadfly. The link to our site is in the description. You can find out about our subscription-based content that's there. We also have a few social platforms that we post on, one of which is a Twitter that you can follow us there, which is the Gadfly MCN, and then also our YouTube channel where we post some of our public content that's listed there. Always exciting and looking forward to conversations that I have with London Paul of the Series Report. You know, he's no stranger to those tuning in. Please also support his work over at theseriesreport.com and find out about his premium subscription podcast, which he posts on a daily basis, sometimes twice a day, once he gets his mic fixed on his new computer. Paul, great day. How are you, sir?
Yeah, good afternoon. Well, no, good morning, actually, and good afternoon, evening to everyone else, wherever they're living. Yeah, we still have problems. I did record one today, and it's a bit of a workaround, so it doesn't sound quite as good. I actually don't really understand what's causing the problem. But anyway, well, let's not digress. We're not here to discuss peculiar technical.
I just had to throw that in there, Paul.
Well, you buy a new device and you hook it up and it goes, oh, technology's great, and then till it doesn't work, and then you've got a bit of a headache. But anyway, we digress. So, yeah, we thought we'd start today talking about Iran. There's a few developments worth discussing. I'm not going to discuss the sort of whole geopolitical nature and how things are unfolding in Iran. We'll park that discussion because that's for another time, another day. And in fact, it's something I'm going to bring up tomorrow when we do the round table. But there has been obviously to varying degrees, significant developments. And we thought we'd address each one of them. And the first one, obviously, there's been reports out of Iran that effectively the number 2 official, this is in the Swiss embassy in Iran, which is effectively a kind of conduit between, or acts as almost the diplomatic arm of the United States in Iran. Well, she obviously fell to her death from a balcony in some tower flats or apartments somewhere in Tehran. And she was reported dead by the Iranian media, and then the Swiss Department of Foreign Affairs confirmed that an employee of their embassy had died. Obviously, subsequently, of course, surprise, surprise, social media started reporting it, and they identified the victim as the official who is the deputy chief of what's perceived to be U.S. interests or the U.S. interest part of the Swiss embassy in Tehran. So, of course, immediately people will come to some conclusion, even though there is no conclusion. And in a very crude sense of the word, there's 3 outcomes. Either it's an accident, it's suicide, or there's foul play. And really, you can dissect it 1,000 other ways, but in broad terms, that's what it is. Now, at this point, there's no indication why she fell. Obviously, it was an 18th floor apartment, so we don't need to say any more in that regard. There isn't at this point apparently suggestions of foul play, but of course this does raise international attention. I would say at this point, it's not worth commenting on. I don't like to sort of start chewing over something when someone's passed away in these circumstances. I
agree. We need to respect that.
Yeah, but the thing is, we have to comment it because someone will say, well, this happened and you didn't make any statements. I mean, what I think is worth mentioning, obviously, since the sort of 79 revolution, as it were, Switzerland's been effectively the official representative of Washington in Iran, because Iran effectively doesn't have any official representation, or direct representation or diplomatic relations with Washington. So effectively, the Swiss embassy is supposed to act and has on occasions as an intermediary between Tehran and Washington. And therefore, I suppose, given the fact that, and we'll talk about the JCPOA and developments amongst all the meetings going on in Vienna, that the timing, therefore, people are trying to perhaps read something into that, and we'll discuss in detail. I don't see any sort of tie-in between those two things. And what's also in the past, the Swiss have been used in negotiations over, because obviously each country, the Iranians and of course the United States, hold nationals from each other's country, almost as political pawns in we'll have a prisoner exchange, and in return, X, Y, and Z happens. And of course, it's worth noting the Swiss did intervene and opened a channel up, so there was food and medicine supplied to the Iranians. Well, to a limited degree, not because of the Swiss, by the way, that's because of the aggressive actions of the United States in terms of sanctions, which sadly were already in place. And then, as we know, the Trump administration decided to impose a significant ratchet of additional sanctions, which caused enormous problems internally. So in Iran, that is. So obviously, it's worth mentioning it. I don't want to attribute anything at this point. I don't see it to be sort of politically motivated or anything. There's no reason to suggest that, but in terms of what's actually happened, and we may never get to the bottom of what's actually happened, but because of the nature of the relationship between the Swiss and the United States and how they act as this conduit, and the timing, as you said before we came on Earth, CJ, as much as anything, is something that is worthy of discussion. But as ever, I'm not one for salacious gossip, and I mean, I could come up with 5 or 10 different reasons, incredible reasons why things might happen, but that's not what we do, and I'm never going to do that. So, but we have to mention it in the context of other developments.
Yes, Paul. I mean, it just, we can respect that, and for her family and the timing thing is critical that we have to take a look at, and specifically as to Iran and the recent news that we've had in regards to the potential that John Kerry had met with Iranian officials to re-engage them, and kind of following up with somewhat the Obama policy as it relates to Iran and their nuclear development, whether energy, what have you. We've covered explicitly several times in regards to the cash payment, the money that was owed to them. But we are starting to see the current administration re-engage Iran out of more so for security for the Middle East. Paul, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, let's park the whole Zarif shitstorm that basically erupted in Iran, and let's talk about the JCPOA. Unfortunately, the JCPOA was rather politicized in the sense that it became this thing where it was the Obama administration, yes, who implemented it. And I've always said, for me, it was probably the only thing that they actually implemented that was sensible. But of course, when Trump came in, it was like, well, this was an Obama, policy, and obviously there was a lot of influence from the Israeli lobby. And for me, rather stupidly, and I've said this before, Trump administration walked away from the JCPOA, which it should never have done. But anyway, it did what it did. So obviously, when the Biden administration came in, bearing in mind Biden was vice president under Obama when the JCPOA was originally negotiated, there was a kind of expectation that there would be this re-engagement with Iran. And to be honest, I'm not interested in politics in a partisan sense. If something gets Iran back inside the JCPOA deal, then that is good for stability in the Middle East. I mean, that's irrefutable. Although I would qualify that as much as there's all this fear that that Iran would therefore enrich uranium to 90% and therefore could create in principle at least, a nuclear warhead. And the irony is Iran will never create or build a nuclear warhead. So it's quite happy to use a bargaining chip of something it doesn't intend doing to secure, some sort of leverage in terms of these negotiations. It's quite ironic. You can leverage something you don't intend doing, but the perception is, well, if they want to think we're doing it, then let them believe we're doing it. And just because we may enrich uranium at 90% doesn't mean anything. But obviously in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I think they've had 3 rounds of discussions in Vienna with regards to the US re-engagement in the JCPOA. Now, there's been sort of varying sort of degrees of cautious optimism to more than cautious optimism to sort of moderate pessimism about developments in terms of the re-engagement of the US in this agreement, and obviously what from Iran's perspective they expect to happen. Now, obviously, from the Iranian perspective is they'll rejoin the JCPOA in totality, but that depends on the US lifting all the sanctions that they agreed to, which is in energy, economic sectors, shipping, banks, etc., Iranian individual people, and then of course there's what probably amounts to about 110 to 120 billion dollars of Iranian funds that sit all over the world frozen. That is actually Iranian money and belongs to them. You imagine if their economy had 110, 120 billion dollars, and that goes back to the fact when there was all this political furore because it's Obama doing this, so all the Republicans went. There was all these strange deals going on, and all this money was being shipped in pallets to Iran, and it's all part of some dodgy deal, and there's all bribery and corruption. No, quite simply, it was because even if you remove sanctions, getting hold of $110 billion actually doesn't happen instantaneously, even though you'd think it would be something that could be resolved quickly. So as a gesture of goodwill back then, when the JCPOA was agreed, the United States, which was the Obama administration, agreed to ship on pallets cash because it was the way to resolve the problem quicker than saying to the Iranians, well, you'll have to wait till all these sanctions are removed, and that could take months because as ever in this crazy world we live in, something that should be just a light switch a moment, or relatively speaking, of course, never turns into that. So that's one of the things. Iran's just saying, we want our money back. It's rightfully ours. I mean, and that would go a long way to alleviating a lot of the economic problems they have, not least, then, if you've got access to that money, then that starts to be able to leverage things in their economy and in terms of lifting the sanctions on economic sectors and all the things we've just discussed. Now, as part of this, there was first off a suggestion that it had been agreed, and then it was denied, which probably means it has been discussed and someone doesn't want it. Someone was trying to put it out there that it had been agreed, where it probably isn't quite at that stage, and that's really just an exchange of Iranian prisoners that are held in the US with obviously Iranian, Western, typically dual nationality holders. There are some obvious American and British people there. They're supposed to be detained, and I use the word allegedly, on charges of espionage. So it's the old thing, we can exchange, prisoner exchange, and as part of this process. But the fundamental thing Iran wants, apart from the lifting of the sanctions, they're saying we want a specific time frame. We want a pre-agreed timetable. We want all our funds frozen to be returned to the Iranian central bank. Countries around the world no longer feel intimidated to trade freely with Iran. And it wants, of course, all the sanctions lifted on POS since 2015, and obviously the additional ones. that were imposed by Trump since they left the JCPOA in 2018. The interesting thing is that they've got the US at these negotiations in Vienna, and you've got the Iranians. But at the moment, Iran still refuses to communicate with the US because the US left the JCPOA. Okay, it's just political grandstanding. But it's now looking likely that if by the end of this month, i.e. the month of May, if an agreement's not reached, then effectively what Iran's going to do is say the JCPOA is utterly dead in the water. I mean, to all intents and purposes, it essentially is. But, and the Iran's not going to accept any of these kind of statements that are being muted that somehow we'll gradually lift sanctions over an unspecified period of time, because unsurprisingly, the Iranians don't trust the United States, and with good reason, sadly. And therefore, the argument is there has to be an agreed timetable. It has to happen quickly, and not some idea, well, we'll remove sanctions on this, but we're going to leave other sanctions in place, and maybe we'll revisit that at some other point in time. And so the bottom line is all sanctions are lifted, or no deal is reached, because no sort of halfway house in this regard is going to be accepted. Now, from the US perspective, there is supposed to be encouragement that they want to conclude the deal with Iran to get Iran back in the JCPOA and to honor the US's previous commitment they signed in 2015. So all this argument that the JCPOA has no legal binding, well, given it's enshrined in the UN Security Council resolution, then yes, it does. What was interesting is, though, and I think within the last few days or so, quite a few senior Israeli officials, including the Mossad director, who's Yossi Cohen, and military senior high-ranking officials, actually met with their US counterparts. And the Israelis actually failed to persuade the US to abandon the JCPOA. In fact, it appears as though they were basically told, look, sort of by hook or by crook, we're going to get Iran back in the JCPOA. And if that means, therefore, on that basis, we need to remove all the sanctions, etc., and then that's going to happen. What I think is absolutely critical is part of this, and this is where Israel doesn't want the JCPOA, and we know the reasons why, but we'll come to the reasons why they should in principle, because quite rightly the US can say to them, look, you're always worried about claims that Iran might have nuclear capability. Well, if they continue and they completely abandon the JCPOA, then they can enrich uranium at 90%, which potentially therefore gives them the ability to create the very weapons you claim that you're frightened of them having. So make your mind up. Do you want them to have the ability to do this, or don't you? Because if they're part of the JCPOA, then they can't, and they've agreed to do that. But we know that that Israel wants to keep harsh sanctions on Iran, and doesn't want them back in the deal, because by definition, I think they full well know Israel's not going to have a nuclear deterrent. That's just an excuse for the US to posture with regard to, Israel to posture with regards to Iran. But more critically, they know full well that if you remove all the sanctions, you give Iran the $110, $120 billion back. They've just signed that massive deal with the Chinese for $400, $500, $600 billion. All of a sudden, Iran starts to become this enormous economic powerhouse in the region. That's what Israel is frightened of, not this threat of nuclear weapons. I mean,
yeah. Just real quick, and not to digress, but in regards to Iran and whether it's nuclear energy or nuclear weapons. I mean, for the most part, if you look at historical information, the nuclear weapons have been more of a defensive measure. Thank God at this point. And when you look at U.S. policy in the Middle East in regards to either Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. It's pretty easy to understand from a defensive perspective as to why one nation state might want nuclear weapons as a deterrent of regime change. So I just want to add that in there, because when I hear people say, well, we can't let them develop nuclear weapons, I'm like, look at our foreign policy. Who wouldn't want that as a safeguard to ensure that the military industrial complex doesn't try to bring some good old freedom to Iran, Paul? But I digress. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. It's a very, it's a very valid point, because that's exactly why, North Korea just, with impunity launches missiles now whenever it likes. The US does nothing about it. I think when a nation has that perceived threat, whether it's reality or not, and Israel may like to claim, but Iran does not have nuclear weapons, and it doesn't even possess the 90% of the enrichment and to make nuclear weapons, and it will not make nuclear weapons. But the mere threat of it gives, as we've said, Iran enormous leverage, and that's why it may have looked at the likes of North Korea and gone, well, actually, if you've got them, or the perceived threat of them, then it sort of puts the US on the knife edge, because at the end of the day, if they launch a preemptive strike on which they won't do, on Iran, and they think, well, the Iranians may possess some nuclear deterrent, well, what's the consequences of that? That could cause an enormous hot war in the Middle East. But also, the other thing is, and we shouldn't rule this out, more importantly, is Iran has very well defined and precision missiles, ballistic missiles, that could strike a serious blow to US bases deployed in the Middle East, of which there's many. It could sink the US fleet in the Persian Gulf rather easily. And the US knows this. I mean, and we also have to go back to the fact that literally, not even at the 9th hour, at the 2 minutes to midnight, on the proverbial doomsday clock, Trump pulled out of a preemptive missile strike on Iran. And the reasons are partly that, but also because Russia's made it very clear to the United States that any preemptive strike on Iran there will be serious consequences, and that's being made very clear to the Israelis as well. So when you look at the fact that the US is really in no position to launch a preemptive strike, so it's rather toothless when it comes to Iran. So here's the argument: okay, the US, bear in mind it's the Biden administration. Okay, administrations are meaningless. But in the context of the illusionary world of politics, the Biden administration, in inverted commas, can go, well, that was a Trump administration decision. So we're not going to lose face with in the world or with the American people, because we've decided, as me being Biden the president as opposed to Biden the vice president, then we need to rejoin the JCPOA. We're going to lift the sanctions, and look, we've safeguarded the Middle East because Iran's not going to have, sort of weapons grade enriched uranium. And the other plain simple fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter what itchy trigger finger Israel has, it can't go to war with Iran on its own, and it's not going to drag the United States in. So Iran is looking at this going, well, we're in a very strong position. We have huge leverage, and then we're not going to budge an inch from our position. We're going to just say, look, you either come back fully as a partner in the JCPOA, or we'll abandon it in totality. Because at the end of the day, the other big sort of leverage that Iran now has is that huge economic deal it's signed with China. Because now the world's starting to go, well, what else could they sign with China? China can, and we've said this before, China is being backstopping them economically, and now they're doing it in an overt way. So the ability to try and get Iran into line is over, and quite simply, effectively now, the ball is in Washington's court. They've probably got a matter of weeks to re-engage. And therefore, on that basis, you would hope that that's what happens. But of course, there's this sort of irony that with regards to, in a broader sense, the whole multipolar world and Eurasian axis is we know what China and Russia's position is. Once you get, and this is what Iran wants, it wants the US back in the JCPOA, it wants all the sanctions removed. It wants to be able to engage with the world again, because Iran will be an enormously strong nation, not militarily, but economically. And it forms another critical component, a big pole in the multipolar world, which you might as well say is a sort of Beijing, Moscow, Tehran axis. At some point, when Europe decides to wake up from its insanity, it will also join. But at the moment, that's a whole separate subject, and we won't touch that today. But
a separate subject, and then also to literally, thank Iran for assisting not only in Iraq but in Syria to defeat Al Qaeda, which is an inconvenient truth to most American politicians, Paul.
Oh yes, I mean, we haven't even began to discuss obviously the role they've played in Iraq, how relations have normalized between the two nations, and they're really growing a lot stronger. There's obviously Iran's role in Syria. Of course, this is what deeply angered, not everyone in the West, but a lot of people in the West, because they say, well, Iran's the what was it? I mean, all sorts of statements. It's the biggest sponsor of terrorism and all this kind of. I mean, it's just nonsensical rhetoric. But yeah, they're furious, but principally because Israel's furious that Iran has started to assert itself in the Middle East and not in an aggressive capacity, but more in a defensive capacity. Okay, you can argue what's going on in Yemen, what's their role in Yemen, but I'm sorry, just look at what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen. Yemen's a subject we've discussed before, and we're not going to get into that today. But yes, certainly the role they're playing in the Middle East, and how we've spoken before about how it's slowly building relations. It's got you can count obviously Iraq as an ally, Lebanon, Syria, Qatar, and what do we find? Of course, now quietly, I think there's been 2 or 3 meetings between the Iranians and the Saudis on normalizing relations, and this is how it's going to be. That eventually, it's a long process, and we you don't put timescales on this, but the whole map of the Middle East is changing, and it's been changing considerably in the last probably 4 or 5 years, and it will continue to do so. But eventually, Iran will be a major pole in the multipolar world and in the Middle East, and that's what Israel doesn't want to happen. And I don't doubt there are people in Israel who genuinely are deeply fearful of what that Iranians may do to Israel. But that, again, is induced propaganda. It's induced fear to frighten people into something that's not a reality. And because as much as we say, the Russians have made it clear to the Americans, if you launch a preemptive strike on, the consequences will be unknown to you. Equally, if the Iranians were ever stupid enough, which they won't be, to launch a preemptive strike on Israel, then Russia will say to Iran, "You're on your own, and you'll take the consequences." And that's fair enough. That's a very sort of even-handed approach to the situation. But Iran's not going to do that. It just wants to have its position back in the world after 40 years in the wilderness. And Iran's going to surprise a lot of people in the future in terms of what it's capable of achieving. It's also very secretly got enormous gold reserves and has had them for a long period of time. The West doesn't largely know about this, but it's leveraging its position for the future. It knows what's coming. And it's going to surprise a lot of people when it's able to become when it's effectively taken off this, the chains that it's been bound in for pretty much 40 years. Okay, we're not getting into, yes, there are internal issues and there are things, rather like all nations, there are problems and they'll have to be addressed. But and that's something obviously we can discuss as well with regards to the sort of developments with Zarif and this obviously leaked 3-hour interview he did with there was an economist and an Iranian presidential advisor. So we'll discuss that next.
Paul, you know what's odd, and this just kind of hit me, is that the millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, that were poured into Saddam Hussein's regime through the United States to support and advocate for the Iran war. Who would have thought that it would take U.S. intervention in Iraq to unite Iran and Iraq? I hate to laugh about it, but that's reality.
Well, yes, it is quite ironic of all, the developments of, but of course, the biggest failure of U.S. policy, apart from the consequences of its policy and all the death, destruction, etc., that have gone on, is the fact they just didn't think anything through logically. They just blundered into countries and didn't ultimately realize that by this blundering in approach and threatening and coercing nations, that eventually they'll force them into the hands of other nations. And they've done is strengthened relations between the Iranians and the Iraqis, and as a consequence of their actions. So it's a lesson they're not learning. They haven't learned, and for the foreseeable future, they're not going to learn. But hopefully, eventually, one day, when they do bring all their forces home from hundreds of bases around the world, there'll be a period of reflection where they'll go, we should never have done this. This is lunacy. Right. And of which it is. And if the US wanted to assert its influence and did it in a positive way, the US would have been in a very different position in the world today than it is. And it's unfortunately, it's reaping what it's sown. But the devastation and consequences for nations across the world are enormous. And that's the other thing. The people of these nations haven't forgotten this, and they're not going to forget easily. And that's why the vast majority of Iraqis and Iraqi military and people, they want the US gone. They've told the US to leave, and the US, thus far, you can argue it's tokenism in terms of the forces they've got there. But I mean, literally every other week, there are rocket attacks on US bases or in the grounds of the US embassy, etc., etc. And largely, the US is doing nothing about it. They're not retaliating or not responding because, again, as I keep using the phrase, the emperor has no clothes, and now the world's beginning to say, no, you haven't. But yes, the consequences for the US behavior in the world is what they've reaped, they're now sowing, and what they've sowed, they're now reaping, and the consequences are producing extraordinary results from the US perspective. But anyone looking in was going to say, look, eventually this was bound to happen. And, it's like the US interference in Saudi Arabia, and MBS has made it very clear in recent weeks in interviews that is very much been the case. And whilst there may be some broad agreement with the US on a number of points, there's a fundamental point of disagreement. And this is pushed the Saudis into, apart from the whole issue, the economic issues and the financial issues and what's going on with the dollar and the US as an hegemonic power, or lack of it. It's their policies force the Saudis into the arms of the Russians and the Chinese, and that's been very symptomatic of a lot of these US vassal states who've just gradually seen the light and gone, well, there is an alternative and we want to embrace that. But the US has accelerated that process because it seems incapable of treating anybody, on equal terms or even remotely equal terms. That includes its allies, which it, threatens, coerces, if they don't, succumb to the US rules-based order. That statement keeps rearing its head again. What does that even mean, rules-based order? No, it's called international law. Everyone knows what it is. Rules-based order is you do what we say, or it's my way or the highway. And increasingly, of course, the world's saying that's not the way it applies anymore.
Correct. Yes. And Paul, just again, for our listeners to understand, we were seeing a shift in policy from the administration, but I think in terms of what the military industrial complex or the deep state, whatever you want to refer to and want to accomplish, I think you can look no further than Afghanistan, where we witnessed both administrations attempt to basically pull U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. And what happened within the past 2 weeks, we witnessed Hillary Clinton and Condoleezza Rice give testimony in regards to why that is such a bad idea, Paul. I mean, that just, and we can be brief on that, but I think that just kind of, hopefully that helps our listeners to explain what is happening in terms of the influence that they're attempting to shift and prevent a policy change, which would be a policy change in the good direction, Paul.
Yeah, because, well, yes, there's always different vested interests with regards to why the US is in Afghanistan. We know the whole original premise was bogus. It was really just to give the US an excuse to move into Afghanistan, and because they wanted to seize the narco trade. Just look at US economic stats sort of pre 9/11, around that point in time, and look at it 12 months later, and the metrics don't stack up. So it was because the US was a major beneficiary of narco trade recipient, well, narco trade wealth, for want of a better description. I use that word, but obviously ill-gotten gains of it. But yes, it's not surprising they've come out and said this, but let's look at the issue. Okay, there's an argument: will the US withdraw all the remaining troops by, ironically, September the 11th this year? What a date to choose! But the point is, already, even though they've said they'll do that, the Taliban have come out and said, well, you agreed by the beginning of May, and they've started to launch preemptive attacks. And I think that will just get worse and worse and worse. But the truth of the matter is, with regard to Afghanistan, I mean, it's a conflict that's cost the United States trillions of dollars, absolutely pointless. And it's cost, well, is it 2,500 US forces, maybe more? We don't know the official statistics, but one death is one death too many. 2,500 American forces dying is totally unacceptable. So whether we take what Biden says with a pinch of salt or in reality, but he actually came out, okay, we know his speech is written by someone, but it was written for a reason. But the words he used were extremely interesting when he said, okay, we went to Afghanistan because of an horrific attack that happened 20 years ago. Okay, 9/11 is what 9/11 is. But he said that cannot explain why we should remain there in 2021. He said we were attacked, we went to war with clear goals. They're claiming we achieved those objectives, which they didn't. But anyway, Bin Laden's dead. Well, that's a whole bone of contention, given he's supposed to have died many years before that in a Dubai hospital. But anyway, that's beside the point. And Al Qaeda was degraded in Afghanistan. And he said it's time to end this forever war. And obviously, he made the argument that this continued military strategy was no longer sustainable. And he came out and said, we cannot continue the cycle of extending or expanding our military presence in Afghanistan, hoping to create ideal conditions for the withdrawal and expecting a different result. And he basically said, look, I'm the fourth US president to preside over this. There was 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and I'm not passing the responsibility on to a fifth. Now, okay, we can argue he didn't write this statement. Somebody did, and somebody wanted to put it out there. And they're pretty powerful words to come out with because, well, you can't argue with any of them from our perspective. They're absolutely factually correct. What is worth noting is, if you look, though, the number of US troops, I think around 2010-11, was actually more than 100,000 US service personnel in the country at that point in time. And then it's gradually whittled down to a couple of thousand. Now, obviously, there are different schools of thought with regards to Afghanistan. There's certainly inside the Beltway, there's people who see these enormous political and national security risks. If Afghanistan, they think, oh, it'll become a haven for terrorists. They genuinely believe that if the US leaves, somehow it'll be a haven for terrorists who want to attack the United States. I mean, And it's not like this is political grandstanding. There are people, we talk about people being brainwashed into believing ludicrous positions that aren't reality. Well, that's one of them. They think that's a possibility, which of course is complete nonsense. You know, if someone's going to, why would it be a haven for people who wanted to attack the United States when it's thousands of miles from the United States? Does anyone ask the question that, you know, well, if there was a terrorist intent on attacking the United States, they'd be embedded inside the United States. They're not going to jump on a plane and turn up in the United States at a moment's notice. I mean, this kind of lunacy that continues to manifest itself in the conscience. But okay, so the drawdown was supposed to effectively begin on the 1st of May, end on September the 11th, and part of the reason for this drawn out process. Now, okay, we're going to go into the argument, is this a reality in a minute? But part of the reason they do this, it's so the US military doesn't look humiliated in the eyes of the world. You know, this is a gradual withdrawal, and it's also apparently often the case that if you suddenly withdraw, it can cause a lot of humiliation to the troops there, and they feel let down, and so all this psychological nonsense as to why they can't just say, right, get everyone on a plane and bring them home next week. Yeah, politics is what it is, diplomacy is what it is, as insane as this actually is. Now, of course, to counter this argument, the US has said, we're going to leave diplomatic and humanitarian forces in the country. And people jump on that and go, well, that probably means they're going to have mercenaries there, and they're just going to flood Afghanistan with a bunch of mercenaries, or instead of regular forces. Now, there's an argument to say that's a possibility. In reality, I think that's extremely unlikely. Truth of the matter is, there's a school of thought inside the United States now that says, do you know what? We've overextended ourselves. We've spent trillions of dollars for no purpose whatsoever. We're no further progressed in what we claim we wanted to achieve when we went there. And actually, there's plenty of other countries who need to start dealing with the problem. Pakistan, Russia, India, China, Turkey, Iran, and the list goes on and on. The withdrawal is not supposed to be condition based. And yes, some inside, of course, the Beltway see this as a huge propaganda victory for the Taliban. And obviously all this, as we said, the nonsense there. Well, this could be harboring terrorists that are going to attack America again. Like we're going to have 9/11 Mark II again, which of course is nonsense. Now, there is an argument that says, well, when the US goes, the Taliban controls about 52% or something of the country. Well, therefore, the Taliban's going to make gains in controlling territory. The Afghan government's going to struggle to hold them at bay because we're not there to support the Afghan government. Well, in truth, they're not really done anything to support the Afghan government anyway. So that's rather a sort of, just a statement to try and justify why troops should be there. And of course, the opposition to removing troops from those who say that diplomacy in the region can't succeed without military presence. Well, curiously, Biden said, well, we gave that argument a decade and it's not proved to be true. Well, yes. And of course, interestingly, again, who's actually saying, well, diplomacy doesn't hinge on us having US forces in harm's way. American forces shouldn't be bargaining chips between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And that's not the reason to keep American troops in Afghanistan indefinitely. And of course, surprise, surprise, the US says they're going to remove. So NATO says, well, we're going to start removing our troops, and Australia is going to do so likely. Also around the same time. Of course, the issue then is what happens with peace talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. Well, the US has tried to do this, and I have to say that some of the diplomatic efforts were pretty good, or in terms of the intention. But really, it's best just to let Pakistan, Turkey, China, Russia, Iran, and other nations to try and deal with this problem, because the truth of the matter is the Taliban are far more inclined to engage with those nations to resolve the governance and the future power structure inside Afghanistan than if the United States does that. So, of course, there's a couple of points with this. Does the US sort of, will they flood it with kind of mercenary black ops lot who come in and will just do the same things that American forces? That is a legitimate question. It seems extremely unlikely. I think Taliban have made it extremely clear that their patience has run out. You may see an acceleration of US forces coming home. The only question, aside from all this, more than anything, is what happens to the opium trade. Because the US is cut off from the opium trade, then despite all the other economic and financial problems and everything that's going on, that alone could collapse the United States in the blink of an eye. So there's the question, what's happening with the opium trade? It's difficult to know what's gone on in recent years as to the extent to how much the US is a beneficiary, because as we said, the Taliban has seized more and more control of areas of Afghanistan that the US may want to have held positions in. So that's open to debate, but I think ultimately this is a watershed moment. There are hotheads inside the Beltway who want the never-ending wars, but I think increasingly there are other elements who are saying we just have to come home and we've just got to let other people deal with these problems because we can't deal with them. We've reached the end of the road. It's costing enormous amounts of money and for no justification. There may be an argument that says the reason they want to bring them all home and not justify any more expense is because the US is struggling to control the opium trade. And that may also be one of the accelerating factors why the US economy is cratering very quickly. I mean, we know it was never in great shape anyway. But if you look at literally the onset of the pandemic and how quickly they had to respond, it may suggest that in fact that the opium trade isn't bearing fruit the way it once did for the US anyway, in which case it starts to become a little bit irrelevant as to whether the US is there or not anyway. Yes. But there again, it's just symptomatic of this huge change. I mean, that whole region's changing. Everywhere all over the world is changing. And these are significant developments there. And that's why I've said for a long time, for Western nations, they need to start to understand that the huge developments have been happening for years in nations and regions thousands of miles and further away from the United States and Europe. And these are the key strategic changes that are happening and why this multipolar world's being bought. Fortunately, the Western nations are just trying to hang on to this old reality, trying to preserve what they've got, instead of realizing in very crude terms, if a company's debt ridden, you can't just keep pumping unlimited amounts of QE or money into that company and keep giving it more and more debt, because if it's debt ridden, the business has to either disappear, you have to strip out the bits of the business that might be profitable and let the rest go. But you can't keep hanging on to that one business and trying to constantly reinflate it with debt. And I'm using the company analogy, multiply that. That's the economic financial system of the West now. They're doing that everywhere, just trying to keep something resuscitated. The person's in the ICU, and the only thing that's keeping them alive is the ICU. If you flip the switch, it flatlines. And that's where we are in the West. And instead of actually looking to the future, trying to realize that we should have adopted the future 20 years ago, but instead we just have this one-dimensional focus, which is power projection all over the world, instead of looking internally in our own nations. The US is sadly the worst example of this, but not entirely, where they'd actually rebuilt the nation internally, then they could have circumvented a lot of the problems that were coming down the track with regards to the fact that the US as an empire has been in decline for decades.
Paul, we could, either pivot in terms of what you just stated, the economic. We could also, discuss India, but I think you had hit a very valid point, and that's the fact that if, for example, if we would have saved the multitude, the trillions of dollars that have been spent the past 20, 25 years on these endless wars, regime change programs, and we would have invested those trillions of dollars here, whether it be infrastructure, education, healthcare, those trillions of dollars. I mean, the livelihood of American lives would be completely different in terms of the direction that we're going today. But hence, we are at this moment. We can't change time, and we're seeing several factors that are just pointing to that decline. And people that are still plugged into the mainstream media are going to get the information spun as to what's happening. So we can we got about 10 minutes left, so we can take the conversation where you'd like, Paul. I've been kind of directing for the most part, so I'll let you decide where you'd like to go with it.
Well, obviously, Ken and I tend to do the financial stuff, and we'll probably chew on things like that. But you make a very good point, and I think we can sort of move into that direction. You talk about, obviously, what is it, $30 trillion that the United States has spent on pointless wars, on regime change, death, destruction, and causing misery for, well, incalculable amounts of people around the world. And the valid point is, yes, we can't change history, but let's look at what could have happened. If the US instead had said, we have the dollar, we are, the world, we will have the world's biggest economy, and we're going to be responsible custodians. But the first thing we're going to do? The United States now could have been in industrial terms, in terms of infrastructure, healthcare, education. It could have led the world easily and been decades ahead of the rest of the world. It could have had a healthcare system the world was crying out for. It could have had the best education system. You know what? It would have attracted great minds into the United States. It would have created a nation with fantastic infrastructure, 21st century cities, the greatest innovation in terms of technology, in terms of agriculture, in terms of true, medical science, not the nonsensical big pharma thing that we have now, and all the positive things. It could have done this, and it could have positioned itself correctly economically and financially, and instead it turned its back on all those things which it could have given to the United States and the people, and then to the world. And if it sold that to the world in a benevolent sense, it would have less all this pointless wars. The world would have actually, instead of a lot of it cowering in fear of the United States for pretty much since World War II, and being living in fear, anger, resentment, and worse, it would have actually looked at the United States and gone, you're a nation the rest of the world does aspire to. We want to embrace the US model of what you could have done and should have done. And really, if you go back to the halcyon days of the United States in the 1880s, 1890s, etc., when it was a great, when it had so many positive things going for it that all kind of disappeared when you started to get the financialization of the United States. And unfortunately, and I've discussed this elsewhere, when you look in history, the sort of Reaganomics was one of the most disastrous things that ever happened, because it really did accelerate the financialization of the United States and the destruction of everything that made the United States a great nation. Okay, the United States had problems. I'm not disputing that, and I'm not saying it was all Reagan's fault why the United States was in that point. But that kind of idea of the financialization of an economy has proved to be an utter disaster, and that's why we are where we are today. But if it made the right decisions, the world would have looked up and admired the United States and held the United States in high regard, which really, surely, that's what you want to be as a nation. You you're in a responsible position, that's what you could do and should do. And okay, people say that's not how the world operates. Well, the world can operate. If enough people say we want the world to operate that way and nations start to embrace it, then becomes the way the future should be. Some people will say this is a very controversial statement. That's precisely what multipolar world is, precisely what China aspires to. It's not dominating the world. Yes, it's going to be in a position where it likes to influence nations and try to develop relations. And no doubt it wants to improve its own status and position in the world from an economic standpoint, etc. No one's disputing that. But equally, what it's proposing to do is for the world to reap the benefits as well. That's an infinitely better model, and it will evolve over time. And in 20, 30 years, it won't be the way it is now. But it's a starting point, and it's a point of progression, and it will unfold in, well, probably still in 50, 60, 70 years, people will still be talking about how this thing started in the early 2000s and how it's still progressing at that point in time. But that's a far better model. That's the model the United States could have adopted. And it didn't. And instead, what it's done is it's ingrained in many people's eyes in the United States that today it's still all about winning. We have to win. We have to turn things around with China. It's all about win, 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 win. Well, the future of the world is not about win, 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 win. It's on a unilateral sense. It's about how does the world win. And the sooner the United States embraces that and changes that, then it can start to become the nation it could have and should have been. And here's the point. Not only would the world have been in a far better position, but the United States and its people would have been in a far better position. And as I've said many times before, there'll come a day when the American people will turn around when the US craters economically, financially, and societally, and they're going to turn around and say, but hang on a minute, you did spend all those trillions of dollars. For what purpose? Look at the state of our nation now. What are you going to do about this? Why didn't you do these things? And there will be a collective and critical mass of Americans who will turn around and realize that. The question is, what are they going to say and do then? Well, they didn't need to ever do this. And, so it's important that we look back in history and realize what could have been. And the US could have had the world in its back pocket in a benevolent, win-win cooperation way. And do you know what? The benefits for the United States would be enormous, but collectively in the world, they'd have been enormous as well. But the US chose not to do that. And we are where we are. And okay, it's not entirely the United States' fault, but I'm sorry to say there's people who will disagree, and that's fine. But the US is responsible for far too much of the mess in the world that exists today. Yes, they're assisted by various people inside Europe and the Five Eyes Alliance and in the UK, and we're not disputing that. But here's the point: without the United States stopped doing this tomorrow, these other nations wouldn't do anything. They'd all crawl back under their shell, pretend that they're not a part of anything. They only do this and feel emboldened because the United States stands there and says it, or the Atlanticists in Europe are coerced or whatever reason to do the bidding for the US in Europe. But predominantly, it's the US that has been driving these lunatic policies for far too long. But more of the world's moved away from that. But still elements in Europe, in the UK, in Australia, less so in New Zealand. Sort of mixed response now in Canada, but because the Five Eyes Alliance isn't quite what it used to be. But when you strip all those out, the Europeans, the rest of the world doesn't want to be part of this, isn't part of it anymore. But of course, struggling out of the iron fist of sort of US hegemony is proving to be very difficult for certain nations, but increasingly nations are moving away, and Japan to some degree, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the list of nations goes on and on. But this is a fundamental change in the world, and it's a necessary change. And the sooner the US realizes what it can actually be, and if it does this, it will be a far stronger nation, and both domestically and internationally, if it packs up its forces, brings them all home and says, okay, that's the end of that policy. What can we do to be a responsible custodian in the world and start to drive the American people would be even more proud of? Yeah, there's a lot of patriotism in the US, and some of that's misplaced and some of it's correct. But the issue is they would actually have a nation that they'd be proud of. When they saw how the US were people, or the United States as a nation, the world responded to it. And I think the difference will be that huge. I think that will be very, very beneficial in terms of the development of the US and the change of attitude. But the problem is, these are oil tankers. You can't change people's attitudes, and it's going to be very, very difficult to do this. But once the US gives up the idea it has to win at all costs, that's an enormous step in the right direction. And I think in a relatively short space of time, but I think a decade from now, the US will be a very, very different place. It's going to be in a state of flux because these things don't change overnight. But it'd be moving in the right direction, as will the rest of the world, because it has no choice but to do that. And I know there's all this fear about what's going to come out of all this great reset and all these things, and people are absolutely fixated with this, and that somehow they're producing this world, or this dystopian world. Well, go and look at Southeast Asia, go to nations, and go and see yourself and tell me where the dystopian future is, because it doesn't exist there. So it's not a global thing. It's not even going to be a domestic thing. It's not going to work. And here's why. Just take the United States. Does anyone seriously believe you could turn the US into a dystopian tyranny, as people like to think, or some totalitarian state, and 350 million Americans are going to sit there and tolerate it? Of course they're not. They're absolutely not. And you're already seeing how certain states are reacting to government's COVID policy. I mean, look at Texas as one example, of Florida. They're just going, no, we're not doing things that way. That's it. Where's the pushback against them? There is no pushback. So the idea that you're going to roll out some totalitarian dictatorship in the United States is an absolute non-starter. It's never going to happen. So where is this totalitarian dictatorship going to roll itself out? The UK? Europe? Really? No, it's not. This is just playing into people's fear that the West can never collapse. Therefore, if there's all this collapse happening, it can't be real. There must be something else happening. There isn't. There's nothing else happening. Nobody in the West has a clue what to do. And that's the biggest concern. You want to be concerned about something, be concerned that they don't know what to do. And because if they had a clue what to do and do that, then we'd be in a better position. So at some point, where's the collective mindset in Western nations that's going to sit there and go, this is what we need to do, and this is how we're going to do it? At the moment, they're just thrashing around, with no clue whatsoever of what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, why it needs to be done. And that's because they're holding on to the old reality, and they refuse to let go of it because they don't understand any other reality.
Yep. Paul, very well said, and want to thank you for another great discussion. Also want to thank our Gadfly subscribers for continuing to support our work on the Gadfly network. For those tuning in for the first time, please find out about our work over at the gadfly.vhx.tv. The link is in the description. And then also please jump over and visit Paul's work over at theseriousreport.com, and also learn about his premium content that's available. Paul, great discussion today. Thank you so much, sir. And we will do this again very soon.
Oh, yeah, absolute pleasure. And thank you too, CJ.